Hi, I'm Brian Dedora. I'm going to tour you through my exhibition here in conjunction with the Contact Photography Festival here in Toronto. We're going to begin here at the beginning, which is not just the beginning of the show, but the beginning of my work with serial photographs and text. If we look here, you'll see that we have a photograph, and the photograph has been generated by the introduction into the scene of a scribbler, which we used to have as primary school students, called Huge. And by introducing the Huge notebook into the scene, then having it developed, it then generated the poems that were written for the pieces. So it's the whole idea of generation, essentially. I'm going to take a look at this one, the very first one here. I'll read to you the poem, and you see how it links up with the photograph. But also, you'll also notice that the poems aren't exactly straight down as you see as in a textbook. These are on a field, which is the page, and the poems are written such that they give certain weight to certain words and sentences. So let me read this for you. Lapstrake broken at the corners, crushed rock, its touchstone and quantity against the black. The rope draws through, man-made things and things done too, changed perhaps and pushed. This place, a place of change, man-made, civilization, lap, strake, and build. The poems are based against all breath pauses as well. The pauses and the spaces that you see on the page here are also breath pauses. So the way it's read, or either silently or out loud, gives us a sense of space as well. We went through various iterations. Here's the notebook with a tree and dead log. Here's a pile of manure. We were working on a farm. It was the 1970s, so it was the back to the land movement. And on a break during the farming, I went out and actually took the photos. Particularly fondness for this one, where this very soft looking rock, I placed the notebook on it, and the wind came along and caught the page. So you get a little bit of animation with this particular photo. And also this incredibly soft looking rock. It looks like dough almost. Here's one within the wheat field, almost hidden from view, but you can see it through the stalks. This one here is split rails. Split rails were made from cedar and split and were used for pioneer fencing. So let me read this one for you as well. Split rail, cedar, for fences, between this and that field, boundaries to know. This from that field, but in that place, piled here and there, sections to defend and fence, defensible. Those split rails there, lines and or rails. These words that fence off in and around, and split rails. That book and page or field fenced, in some sense to be, contained to see, and contained to keep out, split and rail against. Coming to the end of the series in some sense. We have this one here where I threw the notebook into a pond, and so it's floating in the water, releasing bubbles, and we can actually see the bottom of the pond in the photo. The silver gelatin prints are so incredibly different than a scanned print. Not that it's an either or good or better or bad or worse. It's just the particular way this photograph presents itself as a silver gelatin print. I took the huge notebook out of the water. I plopped it onto this wharf here, this little pier, and there it sits. Again, another part of this series is where the huge notebook resides in terms of the space of the photograph. And these are all, in many cases, most cases actually, decentralized. That would become a little more evident in the next piece that we're going to look at, which is from 1976. The next series, 1976, is called Scrap Narrative. And what I did was go out and photograph on the street where I live, here on Dupont, here in Toronto, and photograph scraps of paper. When the pieces were developed and printed, I then wrote, or I selected actually out of the roll, 8 shots, and then wrote on the scraps of paper the little journey or the actual narrative that I was making, which reads like this. To regard, random discard, through attention to selection, to invest in the strength of narrative from cast-off to metaphorical value, beginning at my doorstep. So what you have is a circular motion in this particular piece. Also, this is a very graphic example of my dislocating the central image and taking it to different places within the photograph plane. If they were all straight, it would be fairly boring, actually. But seeing them in this order, high and low, and some central, some off, gives it much more visual appeal than having it completely straight. I love the idea that it ends where I beginning at my doorstep. The idea that it circles. Jumping from the 70s to the 20s, 2021 and 2020, I began this piece called A Hand in Nature. In some sense, a kind of a statement or a discussion, perhaps, if we're so lucky, about our hand in nature. And our hand in nature so far has been fairly destructive. Thank God we do have some positive things to kind of help counterbalance that, but we are in a moment where we really have to ask, what is our hand doing in nature? So the piece begins with a shot of bushes and leaves, quite pristine, beautifully detailed, and then this very awkward hand coming into the photo. Whereas in Huge, I introduced the notebook into the scene, which I photographed. In this case, I introduced my hand. So it's the same kind of trajectory, the same kind of action, but quite different results. So what we have here is a change in vegetation, because this is the center of the piece. So you have a beginning here, you have an ending, and then the middle. And this is why it's been hung this way and displayed this way. Because a part of the show is how we make narrative. What are we doing about wanting narrative, trying to resolve narrative? Whereas in this case, we follow the hand going through, pinching, grasping, palm open, this reach here at the end of the series. You'll notice that the leaves here are desiccated, they're ripped, they're torn, they're bug-eaten. They are not as whole as they were in the first photograph. And then this great shot here, very happy about this shot, with the hand moving into the dark, which was essentially a shadow, but upping the contrast level allowed me to get a shot like this, where the hand is reaching into the dark. Again, a comment on our ecological and climactic moment. In this particular series, It's All Going Sneezingly, was the beginning of my disrupted poster series. I did 37 of these over the summer of 2020 and 2021 during lockdown. And this is the very first one where we're always talking about the sneezing and coughing and this kind of paranoia about it, and are we safe, and are you safe, and am I safe to be with you, and a number of things all going through my head. So the idea is to write on newsprint, and then what I did in this particular case was to keep pinning them over each other, so you're getting a layering as well as a narrative reading of them. So you have the beginning of my sneeze is your squeeze, droplets everywhere, this whole kind of slightly paranoid feeling, and then I began to overlay it with just questions in this one. So that's your default position, I want to get off, etc., etc. There's also, as in one of the pieces in Huge, where the wind caught the notebook, this has also been caught by the wind, and I had to leave it because it was kind of a correspondence with that photograph in the Huge narrative. So you get all this layering, stop coughing, everything going like this, which is also, I mean, I like the readability of it, but I also love the actual photographic space of it. The idea of these different shades, this caught the light, this didn't, this caught the light, that didn't, and then these, I was photographing them against a black wall of a building which is next door to where I live. Really a great backdrop. And so you're getting this black, and with moving the contrast up a bit, in some cases a whole lot, you're getting all these different reflections of light plus these black spaces. The piece ends with, everybody's found this quite humorous, as long as I did as well, because it ends with bad cop, no donut, which is one of those weird little thoughts that you have walking along or waiting in line for something or whatever, and that seemed to be the perfect conclusion to this particular series, right? Moving from this disruption, we have a much more severe disruption in this piece called Considerations. It is a kind of a consolation as well. And what I was trying to do here, again, writing on sheets of newsprint, and then photographing it such that you're not getting the whole photograph or the whole reading. And so what you're doing, or what I'm trying to visually represent here by these photographs, is what happens when we don't know or don't understand a narrative, and we are seeking and looking and trying to figure it out. And this is a way of representing that particular state where we don't know something or we don't understand something. So you have, and again, the idea of the whites and blacks, high contrast, really upped it up here. But lovely details. Here's the gaffer tape holding it to the wall, bits of crumpled paper at the edges of the newsprint. And then these wonderful black spaces here against the white, and then the black writing. However, in a moment of magnanimous generosity, I have allowed you to be able to resolve these by lifting these flaps, handmade flaps, to read not considerations as to whether they are right, but merely that they are actual, a place of exertion, a source of food. I had a conversation with a friend who came to visit the gallery the other day, and we talked about the kind of double abstraction that this piece is. The abstraction of the printed and newsprinted and chopped up, not seeing it whole, brought out, torqued and twisted essentially, and then this resolve. But this is also a part of the abstract. It's black spaces, the black squares or rectangles, and I love these little bone buttons that you can use to pick up the leather covers. This piece is called Cold Comfort Quilt Lockdown. And what I attempted to do here was to give some idea of, when we're all locked down in the slightly crazy thoughts and or worries that we have that are floating through during this particular time. The idea of using a quilt, or finding out if that could be done, stemmed from an article I read on Joyce Wieland, who worked with quilts, and who I also worked with Joyce Wieland when I worked for the Isis Gallery many years ago. But I was writing a piece for a festschrift for a visual artist and writer, Kate Siclossi, and it reminded me of the quilt and the quilt idea. These two things came together, and I thought, I wonder if we can sew photographs to a black canvas and make a quilt. Luckily, across the hall from me was a woman named Wendy Liu, who has a sewing program with 1.3 million followers or so. And Wendy, we tried an experiment piece. It worked out well. We decided on the stitch, and we, between us, created this particular piece. So it's a mixture of the black on white, the newsprint that I've been using in another series, and then white on black, moving from quite out of focus, kind of doubly layered, really, and then this, and then finally to readability. And again, this is as crazy and as strange as the Bad Cop No Donut that we saw in It's All Going Sneezingly in that particular series. But it's just a matter of, but will our savings last? Hiding behind diversion and cake, which is our government, a panoply of frailties and fructivities, etc. This whole idea of these thoughts whirring around, worrying them, making us worried, nervous. Originally, I didn't have the portraits in it, but as we looked at it, we began realizing that the addition of a portrait in this would make it actually more human and would bring that element together other than just the statement. So we were able to assemble it in this particular form. In speaking with Wendy, we had to come up with a way of sewing this. So what Wendy suggested after looking at the project was to sew this square first. That allowed her, because the sewing machine, where the needle mechanism is and the space between the engine is quite shallow. And you couldn't keep bending the photographs or just folding them over as you sewed. So the idea then was to do this square, then this, that, and then finally this. People came visiting the other day and they thought for a moment that the stitching was a digital event, which is not. And they suddenly realized, oh my God, this is real thread. Yes, it is real thread, and sewing these photographs onto the black canvas. So, yeah, I don't know if that's been done before. I've never seen it, but that's the plan, and it worked out really well. Who owns the mortgage on the money you owe, right? Especially in this town. The government racing to third place again. But this is my all-time favorite because this is just so crazy, so completely ridiculous. To pay for the incidental venality of buttering with toe jam, the dry toast of my life. This is the deep end of lockdown. There you go. So for this series here called Black Tea, I decided to, what would happen if I tied a black t-shirt to one of the gratings around the garden, which is behind our building, and then photograph it. What I did was to tie a white sheet behind the fence, which would give me a background for the black t-shirt. What happened, what with all the wind blowing, that the sheet was beginning to move in and out. And I realized, oh, wait a minute. My original idea, I cast it aside and went with the idea that this background that was moving in and out amongst the grading here was actually the purpose of the photographs. This is what was going on here. So despite the t-shirt, although it's tied in different configurations, it stays still while the background is moving. And I thought that's the metaphor that we should be aware of in terms of an analogy to our present life, where our backgrounds are moving, but we are not. It also provides photographically all sorts of wonderful shades, these shadows of the grading against the sheet here, wiggling and changing because the background is moving. You can see in certain areas where the sheet has been blown up, against and through the grading, other places where it's blown back. This is where it's blown forward again, and all the detail and shadow and space in it. Also these wonderful lines that are created just because of the shade, which is always changing as the wind blew the background. So you get shade here, high sun here, some kind of distortion here because it was moving so fast in terms of film speed, and not being able to capture that in terms of, let's say, 1/1000th or something. And ending up, of course, with this very tied t-shirt here. There's places where it becomes quite ambiguous as to what is t-shirt and what is shadow in these here. And all of these, I love this series because there's an unknown about it when you look at it visually. In terms of shade, in terms of light, in terms of where the sheet is at that particular moment in the photograph, whether it's being sucked out or blown in or whatever. And it's just a whole lot of animation, but it's all been stilled. Moving from black tea, we move to white tea. I'm going to stand here a bit, maybe you can see it better. This is the same procedure as black tea, tying it to the grated fence. But in this case, what I did was I upped the contrast so high that you no longer saw the grating or the fencing, and allowing the white t-shirt to hang in space by itself. There's been suggestions of origami, or the t-shirt turning slowly, evolving into a bundle. It would be important to recognize the feather that's in the series. Yeah, it's a lovely piece. I really do like this piece because it just hangs there. It's just there, and does not seem to be anchored. Moving to the second last piece in the show, I had a bunch of watercolor paper, and I thought the idea to write on it, "Get Lost," which I then glued to a tongue suppressor, and then taped the tongue suppressor to, again, the same fencing that I used for the black tea and the white tea, and then took a shot of it, and took various shots, slightly different angles, one closer, a little farther away. And then when I looked at it and laid out, when I got the photographs back after being developed, I thought, man, they would look so good all in a line. And because it's not a complete and straight line. Again, it's slightly decentralized in a way because it floats and goes along. Or as one person who visited the show, who actually ended up buying the piece, said, "We've all been got lost." Which was, what can one say? We've all been got lost. The last piece in the show, just before the light breaks, When I was studying at Ryerson doing a silver gelatin and printing and developing course, there was a machine that would eliminate all the different trays that you would do in old-time photography, the silver gelatin photography. But some students had not realized that they had put the light on their photographic paper. When it was actually developed and printed, it's just all black. And I thought, oh, isn't that interesting? I wonder what I could do with that. So I encouraged my friends who print a lot of this to do 3 black ones and make a series, or available. But it's just black. It's just before you push that shutter. There you go.